The fluorescent lights inside Dale Vickers' scrapyard flickered as the scale tipped, and the man behind the counter smiled the way men smile before they cheat someone who cannot afford to fight back. Jax Harlan stood still. He had learned that stillness in places no one in this town would ever hear about. At his worn combat boots, the German shepherd named Smokey watched the room with amber eyes that missed nothing. He had lost his wife, his house, and his country's memory. Everything he still owned fit in a truck bed full of rusted railroad ties. What Smokey was about to uncover on an old widow's land would rewrite a century-old secret sleeping under Montana dirt. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. The first gray light of morning crept across the cracked asphalt behind the shuttered Texaco station on the eastern edge of Whitetail, Montana, and Jax Harlan felt that light against his closed eyelids the way he had once felt the pale desert dawn against the same eyelids, half a world and half a lifetime away. He did not move. He had learned, a long time ago, that opening the eyes too fast on waking was how a man in his condition lost the next 3 hours to shaking hands and a pulse that would not come down. The inside of the old Ford F-250 smelled of cold coffee, wet canvas, dog, and the particular metallic scent of iron rust that had soaked into the bedliner over the past 19 months of dragging railroad ties out of the abandoned Great Northern right-of-way. The windows were fogged to the thickness of old paper. Beyond that fog, somewhere on the far side of the gravel lot, a semi-truck idled with the slow, patient thumping of a diesel engine that no one had yet shut down. The sound of it was steady, mechanical, familiar. It did not belong to a Humvee in a country he no longer named out loud, and his body eventually accepted that. Smokey was already awake. She always was. The German shepherd lay pressed against his right thigh in the narrow space between the passenger seat and the cab wall, her long flank rising and falling in that disciplined soldier's rhythm she had never lost, even years after her own discharge. Her amber eyes, when Jax finally opened his, were already fixed on his face. Waiting, reading, running the same gentle triage she had been running every morning since the hospital in Germany, since the long flight home, since the day he had walked out of Walter Reed with nothing in his hands but a manila envelope and a leash. "Morning," Jack said. His voice came out low and thin, the way it always did before the first cup of coffee. Smokey's heavy tail thumped exactly once against the floorboard. An acknowledgement. A clearance. She had already swept the immediate perimeter of the vehicle with her ears in the minutes before he woke, and nothing had triggered her. The lot was safe. The town was safe. The day could begin. He sat up slowly. The stiffness in his lower back was a long familiar companion, and he greeted it the way he had learned to greet most pain, with a small exhale and no commentary. He reached under the driver's seat and pulled out the battered metal thermos that had ridden with him from 3 bases across 2 theaters. The coffee inside was cold and bitter and exactly what he had made it to be. He drank half of it standing beside the open door, his breath clouding in the late October air, his eyes moving in the slow, unhurried sweep that no amount of years or civilian clothes or empty gas stations could ever retire. Gas pumps. Chained. Dumpster. Closed. Tree line. Still. Road. Empty. No movement in the east field. No figure behind the plywood on the old diner window across the road. A crow on the power line, watching him with the same professional patience that Smokey used. He poured a careful measure of kibble into the dented steel bowl that lived in a side compartment of the truck and set it down on the cracked asphalt. Smokey stepped down delicately from the cab, her slight limp in the back left leg from a piece of shrapnel that surgeons in Landstuhl had not been able to remove without taking the joint, and she went to her breakfast with the same economical dignity she brought to everything else. She ate without hurry. She had not hurried about food in the 9 years since she had learned, on a hill outside a village Jax would not name, that there was sometimes no more food coming. While she ate, Jax did his inventory. This was the ritual that held the hours together: the bag under the driver's seat, the folded blanket behind the passenger seat, the field jacket on the hook, the canvas backpack against the cab wall, the tarp in the bed, the shovel, the pry bar, the toe strap, the come-along winch, and the old leather work gloves that he had stitched twice with dental floss, the tie-down straps, the 2 5-gallon gas cans, the water jug, the dog bowl and the kibble bag, now back in place. Everything present. Everything in order. A man did not lose anything else unexpectedly if he counted what he had each morning before the world opened its eyes. He checked the glove box last. This was the only part of the ritual that hurt. He did not hurry it, but he did not linger. Inside the glove box lay a matchbox that did not hold matches. Inside the matchbox lay the simple gold wedding band that Lindsay Harlan had left on the kitchen counter of the house in Bozeman on the morning that she had walked out of it for the last time. Beside the matchbox lay a photograph whose edges were burned brown, not from fire, but from the long, slow discoloration of having ridden too many summers in a truck parked in the sun. The photograph showed a younger man in a cleaner uniform holding a laughing woman at a lake whose name he now struggled to place. Beside the photograph lay a thick manila envelope whose creases had become fabric from being opened and closed 1,000 times. The envelope contained the court papers. He closed the glove box. He did not, these days, allow himself more than that. The soldier inside him had long ago learned that grief was like a wound packed with clean gauze. You could change the dressing. You could not keep reopening the flesh beneath. He had been 21 years old the first time he raised his hand. He had been a small-town Montana boy with a scholarship he could not afford to use, and a grandfather whose dog tags hung on the kitchen wall in a frame made of railroad tie fragments. He had enlisted on his birthday. He had served for 14 years. He had deployed 4 times. He had come home the last time on a medevac flight with a femur rebuilt out of titanium pins and a traumatic brain injury that the civilian neurologist would later describe with a careful clinician's distance as consistent with repeated close proximity blast exposure. He had learned to walk again in a hospital on the Potomac. He had learned to sleep in small cautious increments between the nightmares. He had learned to count backwards from 10 in a voice so low that only the dog at the foot of the bed could hear it. And while he had been learning these things, on the other side of the continent, his wife had been learning her own lessons. She had learned how to forge a power of attorney. She had learned how to sell a house in Bozeman without the deployed husband's knowledge. She had learned how to drain a joint account in 11 careful transactions spaced out over 40 days. She had learned how to move a new man into the bedroom a week after the divorce filing, and how to change the locks 2 days before the sheriff served the papers to Jax at the hospital front desk, where he sat in a wheelchair with a tremor in his right hand that would not yet go away. He had been, by the calendar, 41 years old when he left Walter Reed. He had been, by any honest accounting, somebody new. His mother had died while he was on his second deployment. His father had been gone since Jax was 12. His younger brother lived in Phoenix with a wife who had never liked soldiers and a new baby who had never been introduced to her uncle. The few friends he had kept from the unit were either still deployed, or, in 2 specific cases, no longer answering anyone's calls in the first way or the second. He had driven west out of Maryland with the dog in the passenger seat and a pickup truck half full of what the world had permitted him to keep, and he had not found, in the 19 months since, a place that wanted him to stop moving. The Texaco lot was one of 14 places where he slept on a rotation. The sheriff of Whitetail County, a decent man named Obed Haynes, who had done 1 tour in the Gulf in 1991, had told Jax without saying it that as long as he did not stay in the same lot 2 nights in a row and did not leave garbage behind, no deputy would bother him. That was what passed. Now, for Grace. He finished the coffee. He screwed the lid back onto the thermos. He whistled a single low note, and Smokey came to his side and sat at perfect heel without being asked. Her shoulder pressed lightly against the outside of his right knee, the way it had since her first day on the job, when she had been 16 months old and Jax had been a corporal with more patience than sense. "Let's go see how much Dale wants to rob us for today." "Girl," he said quietly. Her tail thumped once against his boot. He loaded her up. He climbed into the driver's seat. The Ford turned over on the third try, the way it had been turning over on the third try since the first freeze, and he eased out of the Texaco lot onto Highway 87 heading north, past the water tower with the fading green paint, past the sign that said Whitetail Population 612 that had been updated to 487 with a careful hand-painted correction sometime in the last decade, past the elementary school and the closed feed store and the Methodist church with its bent white steeple leaning slightly east after last March's windstorm. The Vickers scrap and salvage yard sat a quarter-mile north of town, a gray lot full of gray steel under a gray sky that had not been anything but gray for the last 19 days. Jax pulled the F-250 up to the way station and killed the engine. The back of the truck rode heavy with the 19 rusted tie plates and 7 rotted ties he had pulled 2 days ago from the abandoned Great Northern Spur line that ran crooked through the brush east of Cutbank River. Dale Vickers came out of the office trailer in a Carhartt jacket zipped up to the chin and a John Deere cap pulled low over small blue eyes that had not, in 20 years of running this yard, ever once looked up at the sky to check the weather. He looked first at the bed of the truck. He looked next at Smokey, watching him through the half-open passenger window. He looked at Jax last, and he let the silence run for the 5 seconds that he considered, after long practice, to be the exact duration of humiliation that stopped just short of trouble. "Back again," Dale said. "Back again," Jax said. "You know, I had a customer in last week. Nice fella from Great Falls. Runs a landscaping outfit. He said to me, Dale, where the hell are you sourcing all this rusted junk? It's like the entire rail bed of Montana ended up in your lot." I told him, I said, "I got this scavenger out of Whitetail, old boy with a dog. Crawls around in the weeds for pennies. Real pitiful." Dale grinned with the yellowish half-smile of a man who had never been required, by any force in his life, to be better than he was. I said, "It's like a free service. The county won't haul it, but I got a scavenger who will." Jax did not move. Smokey, in the passenger seat, watched Dale with the kind of steady, unblinking attention that most men, if they had been paying attention, would have recognized as the last quiet moment before something they did not want to happen. Dale was not paying attention. "Weigh it," Jax said. Dale shrugged. He gestured the truck onto the scale. He wrote down a number on a clipboard. He squinted at the number. He wrote down a second, smaller number next to the first. He did not explain the gap. He walked back to the office trailer and returned with $41.16 in cash, which he laid out on the hood of the truck, 1 bill and 1 coin at a time, with an extra little press of his thumb on each, the way a man does when he wants you to feel the weight of his thumb more than the weight of the money. "There you go." "Soldier," Dale said. He always said soldier. He always said it the way a man says a word he thinks is an insult when he is certain nobody important is listening. "Don't spend it all in one place." Jax gathered the money. He folded the bills into a worn leather wallet that had once belonged to his grandfather. He put the change in the coin well of the truck's center console. He did not look at Dale Vickers. He never looked at Dale Vickers during the money exchange. Looking would have required him to decide whether or not to do something, and the dog in the passenger seat had been trained, from a much younger age than Dale could imagine, to read the precise angle of Jax's jaw. He turned the key. He pulled out of the lot. He drove back south through Whitetail with the dog's nose resting on the center console and his own hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, and he counted backwards from 10, slowly, the way the VA counselor at the clinic in Great Falls had taught him, 3 times, because 1 time had not been enough. By the 3rd count, Smokey's tongue had flicked out and touched the back of his wrist, and he had come back to himself, and the knuckles on his right hand had loosened on the wheel. "Good girl," he said. Her tail thumped once against the seat. He turned east onto the gravel cutoff that led eventually to the abandoned Great Northern Spur, where another long day of dragging rusted iron out of cold brush waited for him. He had $41.16 in his pocket, a tank of diesel that would last another 3 days if he was careful, a dog who loved him and the entirety of everything else he had ever owned behind him in a locked steel Texaco lot he could not return to for another 36 hours. And somewhere 17 miles east, a widow he had never met was standing in the kitchen of a sagging railroad section house with a foreclosure notice in her hand, reading it for the 9th time in 3 days, trying to decide whether she was going to die in that house or be dragged out of it by a stranger in a uniform. He did not yet know her. He did not yet know any of this. He drove east, and he did not look in the rearview mirror. The old Great Northern Spur line ran 17 miles east out of Whitetail and died, without ceremony, in a brush-choked draw a half-mile north of what had once been the Kowalski family homestead. No train had rolled on it since the summer of 1967. Nobody in Whitetail, with the possible exception of 3 old men at the back table of the Roundhouse Diner, could have told a stranger the precise year. The rails were still there in places, half buried in prairie grass and alkali dust, the spikes long since scavenged for folk art or thrown away by landowners who had run out of patience with kids cutting through their fence lines. The ties were a different matter. The ties, laid in 1919 out of old-growth Douglas fir soaked in creosote, so dense it had not yet leached out of the grain, were the reason Jax drove out here 3 days a week. He parked the F-250 at the edge of a cut bank above the spur line and killed the engine. The silence that arrived in the absence of the diesel motor was the specific Montana silence of October on the high plains, a silence made of distance and wind and the small dry rattle of cured grass. It was a silence that had frightened him in the early weeks of his return because it was the silence of an outpost between patrols. He had since learned to let it be what it was, a sound that did not want anything from him. He let Smokey out of the passenger door. She stepped down onto the gravel with the slight favoring of her back left leg, and then, as always, ran a fast discipline check of the surrounding terrain with her nose. Wind from the northwest, deer trail crossing the railbed, a hawk's mantle on the fence post, 200 yards east. Nothing human. Nothing that had been human recently. She returned to his side and sat. "All right, girl," Jack said. "We got maybe 4 hours of light." He pulled the pry bar and the shovel and the tow strap out of the bed. He shouldered the canvas backpack that held his water bottle and a wrapped sandwich and a small field kit. He walked down the embankment in the unhurried diagonal gait of a man whose knees had been rebuilt twice. And he began, in the first gray cold of early afternoon, to work a length of track about 300 yards south of where he had stopped yesterday. Smokey did not work with him. She never did. She worked the perimeter. She ranged out in slow, widening circles, nose low, ears shifting independently, checking wind lines the way she had been trained to check them on a road clearance detail. She came back every 5 or 6 minutes. She pressed her flank against his leg for a single count of 1, and then she ranged out again. It was on the 3rd perimeter sweep, maybe 2 hours into the work, that she did something she had never done before. She stopped. Jax was prying out a tie plate with the bar when he felt the quality of the air change behind him. He did not need to look. A man who had spent 14 years relying on a dog for the single most important sensory input he had did not need to look. He set the bar down gently on the ballast and turned. Smokey was standing 40 feet south of him, stock still, nose pointed down the embankment into a brushy gulch that ran east off the railbed. Her ears were fully forward, her tail was level with her spine, not up, not down. Her whole body had the slight forward lean of an animal that had just identified, at an enormous distance, a scent it considered important. She did not look at him. "Smoke. Come." Her head turned 1/4 inch. Her eyes did not leave the gulch. Jax frowned. This was, by a wide margin, the strangest thing his dog had done in 19 months. She had refused commands only 3 times in her life, and every one of those 3 times had turned out to be the difference, for him or for someone beside him, between breathing and not. He walked down to her. He crouched beside her. He put his right hand on her shoulder, and he felt, under the thick winter coat, the specific low thrum of her controlled tension. Not alarm. Not aggression. Something else. Something closer to mission focus. What have you got, girl? She took 3 deliberate steps forward. She stopped again. She looked back at him. Once, and the look was not her usual acknowledgement. The look was a question. She waited. He followed her. They went down the embankment together and into the gulch, pushing through a belt of frost-burned sage, their boots and her paws finding the old deer trail that wound along the base of what had once been a long, low earthen berm. The berm had collapsed, sometime in the last century, into a rough shelf of mineral soil and broken shale. Smokey paused at the base of the shelf. She sniffed along a 10-foot section. She pawed once, twice, 3 times at a particular spot. She looked back at Jax. He crouched and ran his fingers through the dirt she had disturbed. Nothing, just mineral soil and small stones and the occasional fragment of rusted iron that could have come from any piece of failed railway hardware. 10,000 such fragments lay within a mile of where he was kneeling. There was nothing here that should have interested her. But she did not move. He straightened up and looked around him. The gulch ran east for perhaps 400 yards before it opened into a wide sagebrush flat. Beyond the flat, maybe a half-mile out, a single low roof caught the afternoon light, a roof he had not previously noticed, a roof with the particular slope of a railroad section house, the wooden cottages that Great Northern had built 100 years ago for the men who maintained their rail lines. There, a house out there. Girl, he murmured. Huh. Didn't see that before. Smokey did not answer. She was still staring at the spot on the shelf. He was about to reach for her collar to lead her back to work when a voice spoke, clear and dry and entirely unafraid, from about 30 feet behind him. Jax turned slowly. He kept his hands visible. He made no movement that would startle a civilian, least of all a civilian with the kind of voice this one had, which was an old voice, a woman's voice, a voice that had been carrying itself through Montana winters for a very long time. The woman stood at the top of the embankment on the deer trail behind him. She was perhaps 75, perhaps 80. She was small in the way that prairie women get small, which is not the same as becoming frail. She wore a faded blue house dress over a heavy wool men's shirt over long underwear, with unlaced work boots 2 sizes too big for her, and a dark green barn coat that had been patched at both elbows. In her right hand, she held a walking stick carved from a gnarled branch of mountain ash. In her left hand, she held nothing, but the set of her left shoulder told him that her left hand had recently been holding something heavier than it was. Her hair was white and cropped close to the skull, the way a woman cuts her hair when she has stopped asking anyone's permission about it. Her eyes were a washed pale blue. They were fixed, not on him, but on Smokey. And Smokey, after one moment of consideration, had swiveled her whole body toward the woman and was watching her back, not with suspicion, but with the calm, readerly interest of a dog who was recognizing something she had not expected to find. "Ma'am," Jax said. "Those ties," the woman said. She tipped her chin toward the rusted rail hardware scattered along the shelf at Smokey's feet. "Those are mine. This is all my land. From the road ditch out there," she gestured west with the walking stick, "to the far fence posts you can see past the cottonwood. 480 acres, mine." "Yes, ma'am." "I was told by the county this spur line was abandoned right of way. No owner on record. I apologize if I was wrong." The woman considered this. Her eyes did not leave the dog. "The rail company gave it up in 1974, she said eventually. "The county took it, my husband bought it back in 1981 and incorporated it into the home parcel. Filed every proper paper, paid every proper tax for 31 years. Her mouth tightened slightly. "There is a bureaucratic confusion I will not bother you with. Ma'am, I will leave your land." "You will not." He blinked. "Ma'am?" She finally moved her eyes from Smokey to him. She studied his face with an economical precision that reminded him, with a small internal shock, of his grandfather. It was the look of a Montana person measuring another Montana person for the presence or absence of something specific. She was not looking at his jacket or his boots or the gray at his beard. She was looking, he understood, at the set of his eyes. "You are a soldier," she said. "My father was 1st Infantry, Normandy. He came home with his hands and lost his mind in pieces over the next 30 years and never complained about either." She pointed the walking stick at the spot on the shelf where Smokey had been digging. "My husband was a railroad man and spent 52 years on these lines. My name is Margaret Kowalski. You may call me Maggie. Come up to the house. I have coffee." "Ma'am, You will come. Your dog already wants to. I have seen her watching my gulch from the spur for 3 days running." "Soldier, you did not notice." "She did." Jax looked down at Smokey. Smokey was no longer looking at the shelf. She was looking up at him. Her amber eyes held the particular patient expression she used when she had already decided a thing and was waiting for him to catch up. He exhaled. "Yes, ma'am." Maggie Kowalski nodded once and turned and began to walk, with surprising speed for a woman of her age and build, east along the deer trail in the direction of the distant roof. He followed. The Kowalski section house was a wood-frame cottage of perhaps 900 square feet, painted once, long ago, in the dark green that Great Northern had used on all its section housing from the 1890s through the 1930s. Most of the paint had flaked to gray. The front porch sagged. The porch rail had been mended with a length of rebar lashed on with baling wire. Smoke came thin and slow from a stone chimney. A single wooden chair sat on the porch, cushion flattened by decades of sitting, and a folded newspaper from 3 days ago lay under it. At the top of the porch steps, stapled to the door frame at eye level, was a notice printed on yellow card stock. Jax's eyes caught it the instant he came up the porch steps. Notice of impending tax sale and eviction. He did not break stride. He registered it. He made no comment. A soldier did not enter a household's grief before the household had offered it. Maggie opened the door and gestured him in. Smokey looked up at him for clearance, received it with a small dip of the chin, and followed them both inside. The kitchen of the Kowalski section house was the kind of kitchen that had been lived in by the same woman for more than 50 years. The linoleum was worn to the backing in the path between the stove, the sink, and the small square table. A cast iron skillet hung on a hook beside the stove, its handle wrapped in a faded red rag that had been wrapped and rewrapped so many times it had taken the shape of the hand that wrapped it. The walls were the pale yellow of old oilcloth. The curtains at the window over the sink were blue gingham, washed and pressed and rehung by someone who cared about things like that. A percolator coffee pot, already halfway through its cycle, sat on the front burner. But the real tenant of the kitchen was not Maggie. The real tenant of the kitchen was her husband, Henry, who had been dead for 12 years. Jax saw this within 3 seconds of entering the room. Henry lived in the kitchen the way the dead live in the kitchens of widows who have not agreed to let them go. There were 3 photographs on the wall beside the refrigerator. In the first, a tall man in a Great Northern Railway cap stood beside a steam locomotive with his hand on the boiler and his face turned into a laugh. In the second, the same man, 20 years older, stood beside a diesel, holding up a silver anniversary watch to the camera. In the third, he sat in the very chair that was now pushed up to the head of the small square kitchen table, with a book open in front of him and a pencil in his hand, and he was not looking at the camera. He was looking at a point somewhere past the camera, with the specific absorbed expression of a man who had, at the exact moment the shutter fell, been thinking about a puzzle he had been working on for 40 years. The kitchen table itself was covered with that puzzle. Or rather, with the artifacts of that puzzle, carefully arranged, clearly undisturbed by anyone but Maggie, for over a decade. There was a topographical map of Whitetail County, its folds so softened they had become cloth. There were 3 leather-bound journals with ribbon markers trailing out of them. There was a photocopied newspaper article in a clear plastic sleeve. There was a small tin box of what looked like hand-labeled mineral samples. There was a black and white photograph of what appeared to be the rusted skeleton of a railway car half buried in a landslide, which had clearly been taken somewhere around 1920. And at the center of the table, weighing down the corner of the map, was a piece of iron about the size of a fist, stamped with a single word that Jax could read from across the room. The word was Northern. Maggie poured him a cup of coffee and set it on the corner of the table that was not covered in her husband's work. She poured a second cup for herself. She did not sit. She leaned her walking stick against the wall, and she stood, looking out the window over the sink, at the gulch where Smokey had been digging. "The notice on my door," she said, without turning. "You saw it?" "Yes, ma'am." 9 days from today. The Whitetail County Sheriff is going to come up that road. She nodded at the rutted dirt track that wound up from the county line. "And he is going to tell me to leave this house. The house my husband and I bought in 1971. The house in which he died in 1983. The house I have paid every property tax on for 49 years out of a VA widow's pension and egg money. Ma'am, They are going to tell me it is for non-payment of a tax reassessment done 2 years ago. A reassessment that raised my taxes from $684 a year to $11,200. I filed an appeal. The appeal was denied. I filed a second appeal. The second appeal was lost. I drove to the county seat 3 times. The third time, a young man named Prescott sat across from me in a nice office and explained very gently that he was so sorry and there was nothing he could do. Her mouth did something small and sharp. He was sorry. That is the word he used. Jax set his coffee down. "Mrs. Kowalski." "Maggie, what is on that table?" She finally turned. She looked at the table. She looked at the chair where her dead husband had sat. She looked at the piece of iron stamped Northern. She looked at Smokey, who had lain down quietly by the stove and was watching the conversation with the still attentive bearing of a dog who had understood already that something important was being said. And then she looked at Jax, and for the first time since he had met her, her washed blue eyes softened, not with tears, but with the different softness of a woman deciding in one moment to trust a stranger. "What is on that table, soldier?" she said quietly, "is my husband's whole life, and the secret of a train that disappeared in a blizzard on this land in the second week of February 1920, carrying $2 million in gold coin that the Great Northern Railway has quietly for 100 years that it never recovered. The secret my husband spent 50 years hunting. The secret that half this county thought made him insane. The secret I have been sitting with alone since he died." She drew in a thin, careful breath. "And if there is any chance at all that your dog smelled something real in my gulch this afternoon, soldier, then I would like you to come back tomorrow and the day after. And every day there is light, for the next 9 days. Because on the 10th day, this is not going to be my land anymore, and I would like, before I leave it, to know whether my husband was a great man or whether I have been loving a fool." The kitchen was very still. Smokey, beside the stove, did not move, did not blink. Her eyes were fixed on Maggie with the same quality of stillness she had shown in the gulch. Jax looked at the dog. He looked at the table. He looked at the old woman standing with her back straight in a kitchen that would not be hers in 9 days. Outside, a thin, cold wind came up out of the northwest and pressed against the kitchen window. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I will come back tomorrow." He slept that night in the F-250 parked at the top of her rutted dirt drive, with Smokey pressed against his right thigh and the window cracked 2 inches to the cold. And for the first time in 19 months, he did not count backward from 10 before he closed his eyes. The Whitetail County Administrative Building sat at the end of Main Street in the county seat of Crestline, a 40-minute drive east of the section house, in a red brick structure that had been the original territorial courthouse when Montana was still a territory. Jax pulled up to the curb at 9:17 the following morning. He had driven over with the heater blowing hot on his hands, a thermos of fresh coffee between his knees, and Smokey sitting straight in the passenger seat. watching the empty fields unroll past her window with the meditative patience of a dog who had long ago accepted that most roads did not end anywhere interesting. He left her in the truck with the windows cracked and a small treat on the seat beside her. She lay down. She did not protest. She understood that some places were not for her. He walked into the administrative building through the east side door. The air inside was warm and stale and smelled of old copier toner and the specific thin coffee that public buildings in small counties had been brewing without any perceptible change in recipe for 60 years. A woman of about 50 sat behind the front desk, sorting index cards into a file box. She looked up when he came in. Her eyes went to his boots, his jacket, his beard, in that order. Her expression did not change, and that unchanged was itself a specific expression, the blank professional neutrality of a county employee who had decided a long time ago to judge nobody on site and everybody on paperwork. "Morning," Jack said. "I need to speak with someone in the assessor's office about a property matter." "You have an appointment?" "No, ma'am." Rural route, east of Whitetail. Kowalski parcel. Her eyes came up again, and this time something did change in them. A small tightening at the corners. A quick glance to her right, down the corridor toward a closed door. "One moment," she said. She picked up the phone, punched an extension, spoke quietly into it for under 10 seconds, listened, hung up. "Mr. Prescott will see you in a few minutes. Sir, please have a seat." Jack sat in one of 3 hard plastic chairs arranged along the east wall. He did not pick up any of the 3-year-old Field and Stream magazines on the side table. He did not scroll through a phone, because he did not have one. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, and his eyes on the door through which Prescott would come, and he did the slow visual sweep of the room that had, in another life, been the first act of walking into any enclosed space: exits, sight lines, number of personnel, relative positions of any items that could be used as weapons or cover. The exercise took him about 9 seconds. He had stopped being embarrassed about doing it. The east wall held a framed county map. The south wall held a portrait of the current governor. The west wall held a glass-fronted case of trophies and plaques, most of them for youth rodeo sponsorships, a few for local Rotary initiatives. And the north wall, behind the receptionist, held a polished wooden board with the engraved names of all the county assessors going back to 1891. Jax read the list twice. There was a name at the bottom of the list. The most recent name, Arlen Prescott, 2019 to present. Above it, from 1974 to 2004, Jim Prescott. Above that, from 1938 to 1972, Harlan Prescott. Above that, from 1919 to 1937, Alton Prescott. 4 generations of Prescotts, in an unbroken line, had held the office of Whitetail County Assessor since the year before the 1920 train had vanished. Jax did not move. He did not breathe differently. He did not let his face do anything. But a small, specific alarm, the same alarm that used to tell him the quality of a street had just changed, went quietly on in the back of his chest and stayed on. "Mr. Harlan?" A man's voice. Warm. Practiced. He stood. Arlen Prescott was in his middle 40s, soft of body in the way of a man who had spent his adult life behind a desk but had once been athletic enough to retain the shoulders. He wore pressed khakis, a navy blue quarter zip over a pale blue shirt, and a pair of clean suede loafers. His handshake was firm and warm, and 2 seconds too long. His smile reached his teeth and did not reach his eyes, and his eyes were a pale green that did not move at the same speed as the rest of his face. "Come on back, Mr. Harlan. What can we do for you this morning?" The office was clean and bright. A desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, a framed photograph on the credenza of Prescott with a young boy on a lake dock, both of them holding a lake trout between them, both of them smiling the same smile, a potted philodendron on the windowsill, and on the wall behind the desk, a large framed black-and-white aerial photograph of what Jax recognized after a half-second as the eastern portion of Whitetail County, taken perhaps 40 years ago, with a piece of land circled in faint red pencil. The Kowalski parcel. Jax sat. "I came in on behalf of Mrs. Margaret Kowalski," he said. "She received a notice of tax sale and impending eviction. I was hoping to understand whether there is any payment plan or deferment option available to her before the sale goes forward." Prescott settled back into his chair. He put his fingertips together at his chest. He nodded with the slow, sympathetic nod of a man in a church pew at a funeral. "Mrs. Kowalski. Yes. Such a sad case. Such a sad case," he sighed. "You're a friend of hers, Mr. Harlan?" "I am." "Advisor? Representative?" "A friend." "I see." Prescott nodded again, slower. "I appreciate you coming in. I really do. Unfortunately, the appeal window has closed." She filed 2 appeals. Both were heard. Both were denied. The property is scheduled for sale on the 18th, with eviction enforcement on the 17th. I am very, very sorry. Prescott's fingertips remained at his chest. Mineral rights reevaluation. The State Geological Survey issued new data on subsurface deposits in the East County in 2022. We reassessed all affected parcels. 11,200. Yes. On a parcel with potential mineral value, Mr. Harlan. That's what the state decides. My office implements, he smiled. Sadly. I did not create the tax code. I just enforce it. Jax nodded slowly. He glanced at the wall behind Prescott. He let his eyes touch the red-circled aerial photograph for exactly 1/2 second, and he brought them back. Prescott's smile held. That's not a matter of public record until after the sale, Mr. Harlan. I'd like to know the name of the LLC. Prescott's smile held, but behind it something small and interior adjusted. It was a micro-movement Jax had learned to read 12 years ago in rooms he did not describe anymore. A man under polite social pressure was reallocating an internal budget. A decision was being made about what to let through the face next. I'm not sure where you've come across that name, Prescott said smoothly. Public records do list pre-qualified bidders when they are submitted. Yes. Mr. Harlan. Prescott's fingertips came apart. He folded his hands flat on the desk. His voice, when it came, was a fraction lower. Mr. Harlan, I am going to be very direct with you, and I hope you will hear me with the charitable spirit in which I am going to say it. He leaned forward one small calculated inch. Mrs. Kowalski is a sweet woman who has been through a great deal. I have known her for many years. My father knew her husband. She has, in recent years, told a number of colorful stories about lost treasure on her land. She is not alone in this. Henry Kowalski himself was famous for such stories, local folk tradition, harmless. But it is my job as assessor to keep personal feelings out of the administration of the tax code. The code says what it says. I cannot favor a friend. She isn't your friend, Mr. Prescott. She's a woman you're about to take a house from, on a reassessment your office ran, which will be sold to an LLC you control. And your office has been held, continuously, by your family since the year before the gold train disappeared on her land. The room became very still. Prescott looked at him for 3 full seconds without speaking. His pale green eyes did a small flicker Jax had seen before, in men who were recalibrating upward, in one heartbeat, the threat level of the other man in the room. Mr. Harlan, Prescott said, very slowly, I would be careful. Yes, sir. I heard you the first time. Jack stood. He did not offer a handshake. Prescott did not stand. The smile returned to Prescott's face, but it was the same smile now as the aerial photograph behind him, which is to say, a thing with a faint red circle drawn around it. Jax walked out. He walked past the receptionist. He walked through the heavy east side door into the raw cold of the morning, and he stood for a moment at the top of the steps with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the middle distance, and he let his pulse come down. He counted backwards from 10. He counted backwards a second time. By the time he reached his truck, the rattle in his right hand had stopped. Smokey looked up at him from the passenger seat. Her amber eyes were already answering the question he had not yet asked her. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I thought so too." He drove 2 blocks down Main Street and parked in front of the Roundhouse Diner, where he sat for 40 minutes in a corner booth with a plate of eggs and toast and the Missoulian folded in front of him. He did not read the Missoulian. He listened. He listened to 3 men at the counter talking about a bull elk one of them had not shot. He listened to a waitress named Dee refilling a regular's coffee and laughing at a joke he had heard her laugh at the previous 2 times he had sat there. He listened, past all of that, for the one conversation he was actually there for, and it came, the way it always did, at the 3rd table over. "Oh, that old woman. I heard the same thing last week. Henry was the one started it. That poor son of a bitch. I liked him, mind you. I did. But he went out of his mind slowly. Telling everybody who'd listen about a gold shipment. Drew maps. Showed them to my dad. My dad thought it was sad. Somebody will buy it. Probably that young Prescott. Smart fellow. He is, isn't he?" Jax paid for his eggs. He left a $1 tip under the plate. He walked back to his truck. He drove north out of Crestline and pulled into Dale Vickers' scrapyard for the 2nd time in 24 hours. He did not have any new ties in the bed of the truck. He had something else. "Morning, Dale." Dale laughed. It was not a pleasant laugh. "Son, you know that's not how this works?" "I know it isn't. I'm asking anyway." "Why? You finally figuring out even your dog thinks you're a fool?" Smokey, in the passenger seat, turned her head and looked at Dale through the cracked window. Her amber eyes did the long, slow registration of his face that she would later use. In court. Had dogs been allowed in court as evidence of identification? Dale did not notice. "I'm asking," Jack said evenly, "because an old woman is about to lose her house, and I could use the cash to help her with an attorney." Dale laughed again. "Son," he said, "you can't afford an attorney, and that old woman has been losing that house since 1983 and just now noticing. I'm not in the charity business. Get yourself a better dog." Jack said nothing. He got in the truck. He drove back to the Kowalski place. He found Maggie on the back porch of the section house, splitting kindling with a small hatchet in slow, careful strokes. She looked up when he came around the corner. She did not ask him how it had gone. She read his face. She nodded once. "I brought you the names of 3 legal aid clinics in Great Falls," she said. "Obed Haynes drove out an hour ago. Told me you had been to the county. Told me the sheriff's office has no discretion in this matter." He was not smiling when he said it. She set the hatchet down. "You believe me?" "Yes, ma'am." "Yes, ma'am, I do." She exhaled a long, cold cloud of breath into the afternoon air. She looked out toward the gulch, where Smokey, without having been told, had already trotted down the slope and was standing at the same spot on the shelf, looking back at the house. Your dog has been at that spot for 4 hours, Maggie said. I watched her through the window while you were gone. She is not the sort of dog that gets bored. No, ma'am. She is not. He did. By the time Deputy Marcus Kent pulled his cruiser up to the gate of the Kowalski property at 4:50 that afternoon, Jax Harlan had been digging for an hour and 45 minutes at the base of the shelf in the gulch, and he had just, with the tip of the shovel blade, caught a hard wooden edge 3 feet down. He set the shovel aside. He knelt in the cold dirt. He brushed with his bare hand. The wood under the dirt was black with age and hard as stone. It had been soaked a long time ago in the same dense creosote that had preserved the ties along the spur line. He worked the dirt away in a slow, broadening arc. The wood revealed itself as a splintered beam, perhaps 6 inches by 8. It had been broken at both ends, violently, in a way that wood is broken when the thing that breaks it does not negotiate. And on the surviving flat face of the beam, burned in with a 19th-century branding iron, he found 3 letters followed by a partial year. GNR. 992. The final digit was missing, eaten away by 100 years of frost and mineral soil. Great Northern Railway. 192 something. Smokey sat beside him, watching the beam with the attentive professional stillness of a dog whose mission had, 3 minutes ago, been confirmed by the same external evidence she had already known about. Up the slope, the tires of Deputy Kent's cruiser crunched on the gravel. The engine shut off. A door opened. A door closed. Boots on gravel. Then boots on the deer trail. Then a man's voice, carrying on the cold air. Mr. Harlan. Jack stood slowly and turned. He did not hide the beam. He let it lie where it was, half uncovered. Deputy Marcus Kent was perhaps 35, tall, lean, a thin brown mustache, the slightly wary eyes of a man who had, 3 years ago, moved out of Spokane to take a quieter job and had not yet decided whether quieter was actually what he had wanted. His uniform was pressed, his boots were clean, his hand was not on his sidearm. He looked at the hole. He looked at the beam in the hole. He looked at Smokey. He looked at Jax. Mr. Harlan, he said again, I need to see your truck registration and your driver's license. Yes, Deputy. Mr. Prescott at the county office called us this afternoon. He is concerned about unauthorized excavation on county-contested land. Jax did not answer immediately. He retrieved his wallet. He handed over the license. He walked with Kent up the deer trail to the truck. Kent wrote down the plate number. Kent wrote down the registration. Kent looked at the inside of the cab. Kent noticed, because he was trained to notice, the military honorable discharge paperwork tucked behind the visor. His eyes flicked to it. His eyes came back to Jax. Where'd you serve? 3rd Infantry. 1st Ranger Battalion at the end. Kent looked at him for a long moment. He handed the license back. Mr. Prescott also mentioned you might be expected to vacate the premises. No, sir. I'm aware. Kent's jaw moved. I'm just telling you what he said. Kent nodded slowly. He looked at the beam in the hole down in the gulch. He looked at it for a long time. He looked at Maggie, who was standing on the back porch with her hand on the porch rail, watching them without expression. He looked at the deputy's badge on his own chest. He exhaled. You keep your dog close, Mr. Harlan, he said quietly. And Mrs. Kowalski. Ma'am. Any reason you need me out here? Any reason at all? You call the sheriff direct? Obed. Not the general line. Obed. Thank you, deputy. He drove away. Jack stood at the top of the embankment and watched the cruiser's taillights disappear around the bend. Smokey sat beside his boot. Maggie came down off the porch slowly, one careful step at a time, and crossed the yard to him. She stopped at his elbow. She looked down into the gulch at the half-exposed beam. "GNR," she said. Her voice was very quiet. 192 something. "Yes, ma'am." She put her right hand, very briefly, on his forearm. The hand was small and cold and weighed almost nothing. Then she took it away. "Henry," she said, to no one in particular. "You crazy, beautiful son of a bitch." The storm system that came down out of Canada arrived on the fourth day, slower than the weather service had predicted and meaner than anyone had hoped. It announced itself first as a change in the pressure in the late afternoon, a heaviness in the air that Smokey felt before Jax did. She began to pace, not far, just small restless circuits of the yard around the gulch, her nose lifted to the northwest, her ears cycling through the slow high-frequency sweep that she had used, in a previous life, to check for mortars before they came down. He watched her. He understood. He covered the excavation with a blue tarp weighted at the corners with field stones. He stored the tools in the bed of the truck. He ate a thin dinner of peanut butter sandwiches and black coffee with Maggie in her kitchen, the radio on low. A woman on the Havre Am station reading the county livestock auction prices, and then afterward the National Weather Service advisory. A low-pressure trough moving south-southeast across the eastern front. Snow accumulation of 4 to 7 inches. Winds 20 to 35 miles per hour. Wind chill warnings in effect overnight. "You're not sleeping in that truck," Maggie said, not looking at him, setting her coffee cup in the sink. "I have slept in worse weather, ma'am." "Not on my land. You have not." "The back room has a bed. It has not been slept in since Henry died. It needs sleeping in. You are a guest under my roof. That is the end of it." She turned the tap, she rinsed the cup, she turned off the tap. She dried her hands on a red rag that had been folded over the edge of the sink for, Jack suspected, 40 years. Smokey sleeps where she wants to sleep, inside, outside, on the kitchen floor, on the bed. I do not care. "Yes, ma'am." He did not argue further. A man who had lived in a truck for 19 months had learned, slowly, when to accept a roof. The back room of the section house was 9 feet by 10. One window curtain drawn, a single bed with an iron frame painted white that had chipped, along the footboard, to the bare metal beneath. A patchwork quilt, dark blue and dark red, and a faded cream, with the hand-stitched pattern called double wedding ring. A wooden chair, a small braided rug, a nightstand, and on the nightstand, a framed photograph of a younger Henry Kowalski in his great northern cap, laughing with an arm around a younger Maggie in a blue sundress, both of them standing in front of what appeared to be the very porch that Jax had walked onto 2 days ago. Jax did not sit down on the bed that first night. He sat on the wooden chair with his back to the wall, for a long time, and watched the snow begin to fall past the window. Smokey curled up on the braided rug at his feet and was asleep within 6 minutes. He slept that night for the first time, in 4 days, in a bed. He woke at 4:17 in the morning, which was the hour his body had decided on in 2014, and which his body had not, since, been willing to reconsider. The house was absolutely silent. The snow had slowed. Smokey's head was up. She was looking at the window. He went to the window. He moved the curtain 1 inch. He looked out into the blue-gray pre-dawn light of a snow-muted Montana morning. 6 inches of new powder, smooth and undisturbed across the yard and the gulch and the slope beyond. Nothing moved. Nothing had moved. Except there, at the top of the long driveway, in the snow, which had fallen all night steadily, were the fresh wheel tracks of a vehicle that had come up to the gate and turned around and driven back out. The vehicle had not gotten out. The driver had not gotten out. The vehicle had simply come and looked and gone. He watched the tracks for a long time. Then he got dressed. By 6 that morning he was digging again. The digging on the 4th day went slower. The frost had gone into the first 8 inches of soil, The shovel bit into it like cold concrete. He worked in layered gloves. He worked with his breath, making clouds in the low gray light. Smokey ranged out, and came back, and ranged out, and came back, and every time she came back, she stopped beside him and watched him dig for a full 30 seconds before leaving again. On her fourth return, she did not leave. She sat. She watched. She had, he understood, seen enough for the morning. The perimeter was clean. He worked the hole wider. He worked it deeper. The beam with the GNR stamp had been the top of something. Beneath it, by midday, he had uncovered the iron hinges of what appeared to be a strong box the size of a small footlocker. The box itself had collapsed, its sides rotted out, its contents, if it had had contents, long since settled into the surrounding soil. He found, pressed into the black dirt beneath the hinges, three things: a brass button the size of a dime, a small twisted cylinder of metal about the length of a cigarette, and a single coin. He laid the three items out on a clean white cloth on the kitchen table. Maggie looked at them for a full minute without speaking. Then she went to her husband's shelf in the parlor, and she returned with a small glass loupe that Henry Kowalski had bought at an estate sale in 1987. And she bent over the table with the loupe to her eye, and she studied the objects one at a time. The button was brass, cast, with the raised initials GNR along its rim and, at its center, a tiny steam locomotive in profile. Railway Guards uniform. Standard issue, 1910 through 1924. The twisted cylinder was what remained of a commercial blasting cap, the kind used in railway demolition or tunnel clearing, corroded beyond serviceability but unambiguous in its form. The coin was smaller than a modern quarter and heavier than it looked. She laid it flat on the table. She turned it with the end of a toothpick. The face of Lady Liberty stared up from its dirt-stained surface. The date below her chin had been eaten away at the edges, but the first three digits were clear, and the fourth was a curve that could only be a zero. A Liberty head gold half-eagle, 1900 or 1910 or 1920. Maggie sat down in Henry's chair. She put the loupe on the table. She put her hands flat on the table, on either side of the three objects. She closed her eyes. "Maggie," Jack said quietly. "In a minute," she said. He gave her the minute. He gave her two. She breathed, slow and steady, and eventually she opened her eyes, and the washed blue of them held the long, patient grief of a woman who had been waiting 30 years to find out whether she was going to have to apologize, in her own head, to a dead man. "He was not crazy," she said. "No, ma'am." "He sat at this table," she said, "for 37 years, at this exact table. He drew maps, he made calculations, he compared freight manifests from 1919 and 1920, he tracked the weather patterns that February. He talked to every old section hand still alive in 4 counties, and he came to the conclusion, based on work that I could not, for the life of me, follow, that the lost 1920 shipment had not, as the company claimed, simply gone missing somewhere on the main line. He concluded that a diversion had occurred, that someone had sighted the shipment car onto an unmarked spur in a blizzard, that the spur had collapsed into an avalanche, that the car was down there somewhere under 100 years of soil, on our land." "Yes, ma'am." He told 3 people. The first was the reporter at the Great Falls Tribune who came out here in 1978 and wrote a very nice article about Henry's colorful theory. The second was Jim Prescott, who came to this kitchen in 1981 and sat in that chair. She pointed to the chair Jax was sitting in and listened for 2 hours and then offered Henry $500 for the mineral rights to the East 40. The third was Jim Prescott's son, Arlen, who came here twice, once in the fall of 1996 when he was in college and once in the spring of 2006 when he was beginning his career in county government. Each time, very polite, each time, very curious. Each time my husband sent him away. She looked at Jax. "My husband died of a stroke 3 weeks after the last of those visits. He had been, up until 4 days before it happened, perfectly well. The medical examiner recorded natural causes. I have not, in the 14 years since, permitted myself to think about the timing. Jax looked at the coin. Maggie, he said carefully, I need to ask you a question, and I need you to answer it exactly. Do you still have Henry's journals? All of them? All of them. Can I see them? You will see them tonight. After supper, with a lamp. She reached out and laid one dry, thin hand over his own for the second time. Not now. Now. I need you to do what you came here to do, and what your dog came here to do. Go back to that hole, soldier. Dig. Find me whatever else is down there, because I would like, before the sheriff comes up that driveway on the 17th, to know what my husband was killed for. He dug for the rest of that day until the light failed. He dug for the rest of the 5th day, from first gray to last gray. On the morning of the 6th day, he drove into Whitetail for supplies. He did not want to. He needed diesel, food, batteries for his lantern, and a new pair of work gloves. He parked at the Senex station on the north end of town. He filled the tank. He walked across the gravel to the little general store that was connected by a covered plywood breezeway to the Senex. Smokey stayed in the truck. The day was cold and gray, and the wind had come up out of the west and was stripping the last of the cottonwood leaves along the creek. The general store was warm and smelled of fryer grease and hot coffee and cheap candy. 3 men stood in a loose clump near the coffee urn. He recognized 2 of them. One was Dale Vickers' grown son Tucker, a thick-bodied man in his 30s who worked at his father's scrapyard and drank most evenings at the Whitetail bar. The other was Tucker's cousin Bryce, a skinny man with a weak chin and a loud laugh. The third man, Jax did not know, a stranger, maybe a traveler, maybe a rancher down from the High Line. Jax got his gloves and his batteries and his coffee and his small bag of beef jerky, and he walked to the counter. The 3 men by the coffee urn watched him cross the store. He did not need to look at them to know this. He felt the collective quality of their attention, the way a deer feels wind direction. He paid for his things. He started for the door. Hey, soldier. He did not stop. Hey, scavenger. He kept walking. He pushed the glass door open. The cold hit him. He stepped out into the gravel lot. Tucker followed. Bryce followed. The stranger did not follow. The glass door eased itself shut behind them with a low sigh of its pneumatic closer. My old man said you've been out at the Kowalski place, Tucker said. Loud enough for anyone at the Senex pumps to hear. Old Maggie up there. Crazy old Maggie. Jax kept walking. His truck was 40 feet away. You running the same con her husband ran? Telling her you're gonna dig up a gold train? You getting her to sign something over? You banging her? A laugh. Hey. I'm talking to you, scavenger. The wind shifted. It brought with it, from the 2 idling diesel pickups at the Senex pumps, a dense lungful of diesel exhaust. The exhaust hit the specific cold of the morning. The cold hit the back of his neck. Tucker's laugh, the exact pitch of it, the exact rhythm of it, landed wrong in the front of his brain. The world slid. It did not slide far. It slid about 3 inches to the left, the way it had slid in 2013, in the dusty gravel yard behind a school outside a town whose name he did not say anymore. On the afternoon, when the interpreter had laughed the wrong laugh at the wrong moment, and the boy at the end of the alley had stopped walking, and Jax had needed, in the space of about 2 seconds, to make a decision that he had later, for a year and a half, been unable to remember making. The world had slid that afternoon in exactly the way it was sliding now. The diesel smell thickened. The laugh came again. Jax's right hand, at his side, began to tremble in the fine, involuntary way it had trembled at Walter Reed. He stopped walking. He did not turn. He stood in the gravel lot between the general store and his truck, and the cold air went into his lungs and did not go out, and the gravel under his boots was gravel and was not gravel, and Tucker Vickers was 40 feet behind him, making the precise sound that his brain, without his permission, had selected as the sound that meant something was about to happen that could not be taken back. He counted backwards from 10. He got to 7. From inside his truck, Smokey began to bark. It was not her alert bark. It was not her threat bark. It was something else. It was a hard, bright, focused bark with a rhythm to it, a specific pattern, 3 short, 1 long, 3 short, that she had used exactly twice in her life, once on a hillside outside a foreign village when Jax had been about to step into a wire, and once in a hospital hallway in Landstuhl, the first time a nurse had come at his IV line from the side at the wrong angle. It was her recall bark. It meant, come back to me. Now. Her front paws were on the dashboard. Her amber eyes were fixed on the back of his head through the windshield. She was not loud in the sense of volume. She was loud in the sense of a dog who had, after 9 years of service, built a bark that went into her handler's body below the level of his thoughts. Jax exhaled. He finished the count. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. He walked to his truck. He opened the driver's door. He got in. He shut the door. He did not look back at Tucker Vickers. He started the engine. He pulled out of the lot. He drove east out of Whitetail on Highway 87 with his hands at 10 and 2, and his breath going in and out in a slow 4-count, and Smokey, her recall bark having ceased the instant he had closed his door, climbed carefully down from the dashboard and lay across the center console with her head on his right thigh. He reached down. He laid his right hand on the top of her skull. He kept it there. "Good girl," he said. "Good girl. Good girl." He did not go back to Maggie's that night. He drove instead to a ridge road 6 miles west of the section house, a dirt Forest Service road that climbed up the shoulder of a low bluff and dead-ended at an old fire lookout foundation. He parked with the nose of the truck pointed west. He sat in the driver's seat for the long, cold hour between dusk and dark. He ate 3 strips of jerky. He drank water from the jug. Smokey ate a small supper from her dish on the seat. The sky went from gray to dark gray, to a bottomless black, with a thin band of red at the horizon line, and then just to black. He did not go into the cab to sleep. He sat in the driver's seat with his arms folded across his chest and his eyes open. He thought. He thought about a small, quiet kitchen and a woman who was going to lose it in 3 days. He thought about a dead man's journals he had not yet read. He thought about a pale green pair of eyes in an office in Crestline. He thought about his own 18 years of ruined sleep, and he thought about the specific cost, which he had been counting for 19 months, of letting any other person become his responsibility. He was tired. He was 42 years old, and had been tired since 2013. He was broke and alone, and owed no one anything. He had not asked for the old widow. He had not asked for the gulch. He had not asked for the skeletal hand of a dead sheriff's family legacy reaching up out of Montana dirt to close itself around his sleeve. A man got to choose, in his life, the small finite number of things he was willing to bleed for. He had already done his bleeding. He had bled more than most. He was owed nothing further. He could start the F-250 in 20 minutes, and he could drive east on the county road. And by the time the first gray light came up behind him in the rear view, he could be over the Dakota line, and no one in Whitetail, Montana would ever see him or his dog again. He thought about this for a long time. Smokey did not sleep. Smokey sat upright in the passenger seat with her ears at half-mast and her eyes on the black tree line beyond the windshield, and she did not, at any point in the 2 hours he sat thinking, look once at him. She was waiting. She was letting him have the decision. That had always been the deal off-duty. She was his dog. On duty she was his partner. But decisions about what mission to take had always been his alone to make. She would follow him east in the morning. She would follow him anywhere. At 3:40 in the morning, the thin band of red came back to the eastern horizon, and Jax lifted his hands from where they had been folded across his chest, and he started the engine. And he turned the truck around, and he drove east. He drove east down off the ridge. He drove east onto the county road. He drove east to the turnoff for the Kowalski property. He turned right, and he drove up the rutted dirt track, and he came to a slow stop at the top of the drive, and he killed the engine. The kitchen window of the section house was glowing pale yellow in the last minutes before sunrise. Maggie was in there, alone, making coffee for one. Smokey looked at him. Her tail thumped once, softly, against the seat. "Yeah," he said. "I know." He got out of the truck. Maggie did not ask him where he had been. She poured him a cup of coffee. She set it down on the small square kitchen table beside her husband's old place. She pushed, across the tablecloth toward him, a thick blue cloth-bound volume that she had set out an hour ago. The lettering on the spine was in silver, embossed, worn to a soft gray at the corners. Field Notes, H. Kowalski, 1982 to 1994. "Read the entries from April 1996 forward," she said. "It will not take you long." He had stopped being able to write much by the end. "But you will understand the shape of it." Jack sat. He drank the coffee slowly. He opened the journal. He read. He was still reading when, at 10 minutes past 9 that morning, the Black County SUV came up the drive, followed a quarter-mile back by Deputy Kent's cruiser. He closed the journal. He stood up. Maggie at the sink also stood. She had been washing a coffee cup. She set the cup down on the dish rack. She dried her hands slowly on the red rag. She turned to the window and looked out at the two vehicles coming up the drive, and her face, which had held all morning the fragile, cautious joy of a widow reading her husband's vindication for the first time, closed down into something older and harder and more prepared. She picked up her walking stick from the corner. "Out on the porch, soldier," she said quietly. "This we meet head-on." He went out on the porch. Smokey came with him. She did not need to be called. She had already been at the back door, had already swept the driveway with her eyes the moment the sound of the first engine had reached her, and she fell in at his right knee as he crossed the kitchen and stepped out into the cold morning light. The black SUV rolled up the long gravel drive and stopped 20 feet short of the porch. The cruiser stopped 10 feet behind it. The doors opened. Arlen Prescott got out of the SUV wearing a charcoal wool overcoat over his pressed khakis, leather gloves, a clipboard in his left hand, his pale green eyes very bright in the cold. Deputy Marcus Kent got out of the cruiser. Kent was in his uniform, his jaw was set, his right hand was not anywhere near his sidearm. He walked forward slowly, stopped at the corner of the SUV, and stood at a careful angle that put his body not behind Prescott, but slightly to the side, as though without explicitly choosing to, he had taken up the flanking position of an honor guard to a funeral neither of them had yet declared. "Mrs. Kowalski." "Mr. Harlan," Prescott said it warmly, audibly, for whatever record might later exist. "Good morning." Neither Maggie nor Jax answered. Prescott consulted his clipboard. He held it up at an angle that the cold light caught on the clear plastic cover. "Mrs. Kowalski, I'm here to serve you, in person, with the final enforcement notice. Sheriff's eviction is scheduled for 8 a.m. the day after tomorrow. I am required, under state statute, to deliver to you in person the list of personal property you are allowed to remove and the list that will be retained by the county for auction." He held the clipboard out. "Please take this." Maggie did not take it. "Mrs. Kowalski," set it on the porch rail. "Mr.
Prescott."
"If you would." Prescott smiled the tight smile of a man who had expected this and had prepared for it. He set the clipboard on the porch rail. "Mr. Harlan," he turned, without changing his expression, to face Jack. "I am also here to hand-deliver a cease-and-desist order pertaining to all excavation activity on the property, effective immediately, until the county's investigation into the unauthorized disturbance of potentially protected archaeological material is concluded. I do not expect that investigation to take long. I suspect it will conclude, quite reasonably, that what you have been digging up is nothing but old railroad garbage." He held out a second piece of paper. Please take this. Step away from the hole. Gather your things. Leave the property. He said it mildly. He said it in the same mild voice a man uses when he is telling an animal to get off a piece of furniture, and he is confident the animal will. Jax did not take the paper. He did not move at all. He stood on the porch, at the top step, with his hands resting at his sides, and his eyes on Arlen Prescott's face. And he let the silence between them extend, and extend, and extend, until Prescott's small bright smile began, at one corner, to crack. Smoky, at his right knee, sat. She did not growl. She did not show her teeth. She did not shift her weight. She sat at perfect heel with her ears half forward and her amber eyes fixed on Arlen Prescott's throat, and she did not blink. Prescott looked down at her. "That dog," he said, and his mild voice became, with a small, careful effort, mildly amused, "is a very quiet dog. I will say that. My wife has a little Maltese that she got last Christmas. The little thing will not shut up. You hear me, Ma? This dog, though, very quiet, very well trained." He looked up at Jax. "Is she a mutt? She looks part mutt." Deputy Kent, behind Prescott, closed his eyes briefly. Jax said nothing. Prescott tried a second smile. It fit worse than the first. "Mr. Harlan, Mrs. Kowalski, I need you to take these papers. This is a legal procedure. I do not want this to become unpleasant. I'm a county employee doing his job." It was at that precise moment that Smokey broke her sit. She did not stand slowly. She did not stand with warning. She simply was sitting, and then she was not. She rose with the specific fluid efficiency of a dog who had, in an earlier life, risen that way to exit a Humvee on a road clearance operation. Her body passed Jax's right leg at the exact angle that her body had passed his right leg 10,000 times in another country. She did not look up at him for permission. She did not break cadence. She walked. She walked down the porch steps, past Arlen Prescott at a distance of perhaps 4 feet, ignoring him entirely, as though he were a traffic cone in a parking lot. She walked past Deputy Kent at the same unhurried gait. Kent did not move. Kent watched her go. She crossed the gravel drive. She crossed the strip of dead grass at the edge of the drive. She descended the slope into the gulch. She did not stop at the shelf where Jax had dug for the past 5 days. She walked past the open excavation with its blue tarp weighted at the corners. She walked another 10 feet north along the base of the collapsed berm. She stopped. She lowered her head. She pressed her nose to the ground for a long 4 seconds. She raised her head. She lowered it again. She pawed once, hard, with her right front paw. The earth broke. She pawed again, and again, and again. Then she began to dig. She dug with the hard, focused rhythm of an animal pursuing an assignment she had been waiting for 5 days to complete. Dirt flew between her back legs in a spray. Her front paws worked in a rapid, measured alternation. Her shoulders went down and up and down and up. She did not pant. She did not growl. She dug with the clean, controlled fury of a working dog who had, in her own estimation, already been patient for longer than any reasonable animal should have been asked to be. On the porch, nobody moved. Prescott, the second piece of paper still in his outstretched hand, watched her dig with the small, fixed smile of a man whose expression had become, in the last 20 seconds, a thing he was no longer steering. Deputy Kent, behind him, had turned his head slightly so that he could see both Prescott and the dog at the same time. Maggie, at Jax's right shoulder, had both hands wrapped around the head of her walking stick. Her knuckles were white. Jax watched Smokey. He did not call her off. He had not called her off of anything important in her whole life, and he was not going to start now. She dug for perhaps 4 minutes. Then she stopped. She stepped back from the hole she had opened. Her breath came out of her in slow, even clouds. She looked down into what she had uncovered. She turned, and she looked back up at the porch, at Jax. Her amber eyes held his. Her left forepaw came up and, very deliberately, pointed at the hole. It was a posture she had been trained to hold, at the request of an army handler 1,500 miles away and 10 years ago, on the occasion of her having located something underground that she believed her handler should look at. "I'm coming, girl," Jack said quietly. He came down off the porch. He crossed the gravel drive at an unhurried pace. He passed Prescott without looking at him. He passed Kent. Kent turned to watch him. He descended into the gulch. He crossed the open excavation. He went to the new hole. He knelt. He brushed away the loose dirt with his bare hands. What his hands revealed, in the pale gray light of the cold Montana morning, was this: a dark green painted panel of heavy steel, the paint blistered and flaked, the metal beneath pocked with a century of rust, hinges, a framework of riveted iron, a curved top edge, the side of what unmistakably had once been the door of a railway boxcar. The paint remained, in patches, the same specific shade of deep forest green that the Great Northern Railway had used on its freight stock from 1910 through the middle of the 1920s. Beside the buried door, half emerged from the loose earth that Smokey's paws had displaced, was something smaller. Something paler. Something shaped. Jax brushed, very gently, with the side of his thumb. The shape came clear. A human hand, skeletal, stripped of flesh by the 100 years that had passed over it. Small bones in the relaxed curl of a grip that had long since forgotten what it was gripping. The metacarpals were intact. The phalanges had mostly remained in anatomical alignment. The bones were the pale amber color of old ivory. The dirt had preserved them far better than any above-ground environment would have. Between the bones of the thumb and forefinger, wedged gently where it had sat for 100 years, was a coin. Liberty Head. Gold. The date, in the angled morning light, was entirely legible. 1920. Jax did not touch the coin. He did not touch the bones. He straightened up slowly. He turned. He looked up the slope toward the porch. "Deputy Kent," he called. His voice was calm and low and carried perfectly in the cold, still air. "I need you down here, sir. Please." Kent came. He came fast, but controlled, down the slope in the long strides of a tall man who had grown up on cold country. He stopped 2 feet from the edge of the hole. He looked down. He did not speak for several seconds. Then he reached up to his right shoulder and unclipped the radio from his shoulder strap. "Dispatch, Kent. Patch me through to Sheriff Haynes. Priority." A moment of static. A woman's voice. "Stand by, deputy." Kent waited. His eyes did not leave the hole. "Obed," he said, when the sheriff's voice came through, "I'm out at the Kowalski place. I've got a situation here. Arlen Prescott is present to execute a cease and desist against Mr. Harlan and an eviction notice against Mrs. Kowalski. Mr. Harlan's dog has just uncovered a painted boxcar door marked in what appears to be Great Northern Railway livery, and human skeletal remains with a 1920 gold coin in the hand." A pause. "Yes, sir. Human remains. Yes, sir. A coin. I am requesting a hold on all county enforcement actions at this location pending federal notification." Another pause. "I understand. Yes, sir. I will inform them." He clipped the radio back. He turned. He looked up the slope. "Mr. Prescott." Prescott, still on the porch, had not moved since Smokey had descended into the gulch. His face, at this distance, was a small, pale rectangle above the dark wool overcoat. The clipboard was still in his hand. The cease and desist paper that he had been extending to Jax was, also, still in his hand. "Mr. Prescott, sir, I'm going to need you to come down here, please." Prescott came. He came stiffly, down the porch steps, across the gravel drive, his leather-gloved hands now hanging at his sides, the clipboard and the paper pinched against his thigh. He walked past Maggie on the porch without looking at her. He came down the slope. He stopped at the edge of the hole. He looked in. His face did something very small and very complicated. Jax, who had spent 14 years reading the faces of men under sudden pressure, read it easily. It was the face of a man to whom 3 separate disasters had just been delivered in a single package, and who was, in the space of about 3 heartbeats, discovering that he had no plan for any of them. "That is not what it looks like," Prescott said. "That is not. That is old cattle bones. That is—" "Mr. Prescott, sir, I'm going to need you to step back from the site. Please, this is now a federal matter. The Department of the Interior handles unrecovered railway cargo from the protected historical period. I am going to need to preserve the scene. I'm also going to need to ask you to return to your vehicle and remain there until the sheriff arrives." Prescott did not move. "Deputy Kent," Prescott said. His voice had become, in the space of one sentence, a different voice. It was a voice that Jax had also heard before. It was the voice of a man trying, for the first time in his adult life, to give an order that he was not, by any rule of the world, qualified to give. "Deputy, I am the Whitetail County Assessor. This land is in county administrative custody pending sale. Any artifact found on this land is county property until such time as—" "Mr. Prescott, the sale has concluded, at which time it becomes the property of the winning bidder. Those are the regulations. This is county." "Mr. Prescott, sir." Kent's voice, for the first time, went up in volume, just enough. "I need you to walk back up to your vehicle. Now." Prescott looked at him. Prescott looked at Jax. Prescott looked, last, at the skeletal hand with its gold coin, at the base of the painted boxcar door, in the dirt of a widow's land that had belonged to his family's quiet ambition for 100 years. Something in him gave. Not a breakdown, something smaller, something that was the beginning of a breakdown that would, later, in other rooms, finish itself. His mouth moved twice without making any sound. He turned, he walked stiffly back up the slope. He stopped at the porch, briefly at the foot of the steps, as though he had one more thing to say to Maggie. He did not say it. He kept walking. He got in the black SUV. He did not start it. He sat in it with both hands on the wheel. On the porch, Margaret Kowalski's walking stick slipped out of her hands. It made one small clatter against the porch boards. Her knees folded under her. Slowly, with the soft, dignified surrender of a very old woman who had been holding herself up, for longer than anyone knew, on nothing but the muscle of her jaw. She went down to her knees on the porch. She did not cry out. She did not gasp. Her eyes were open and fixed on the middle distance, and her mouth moved without sound. Jax climbed out of the hole. He went up the slope. He took the porch steps 2 at a time. He knelt beside her. He did not touch her. Not immediately. He knew better than to touch. He knelt at the same level as her face, and he let her see him, and he waited. Her hand, after a long moment, came up and found his forearm. It closed on his sleeve. "Henry," she whispered. "Yes, ma'am." "Yes, ma'am." "Yes, ma'am." He was right. She made a sound. It was not a sob. It was something older and smaller than a sob. It was the sound of a woman who had been carrying, alone for 20 years, a specific unshared grief which had just, in the space of 4 minutes, been lifted off of her by a dog and a stranger and the bones of a man she had never met. Smokey, who had come up the slope quietly behind Jax, sat down in front of Maggie. She did not crowd her. She sat at a respectful distance, her amber eyes on the old woman's face. Then, slowly, she lowered her head, and she pressed the flat of her muzzle against the back of Maggie's hand where it lay on Jax's sleeve. Maggie made the sound again. She opened her hand. She put it on Smokey's head. She held it there. She stayed like that, on her knees, her hand on the dog's head, her other hand on Jax's sleeve, for about 5 minutes. Nobody on the property spoke. Deputy Kent stood quietly at the bottom of the porch steps, facing outward, his back to them in the specific deliberate way that a decent man gives a woman a wall of privacy when she has earned one. Arlen Prescott sat in his black SUV with both hands on the wheel and did not look at any of them. From a long way away, out on the county road, the sound of a second cruiser's siren came low and distant and growing. The sound of Sheriff Obed Haynes driving fast from town. Jax looked down at the dog's thick ruff, under the old woman's fingers. He looked at the side of Maggie's weather-burned cheek. He looked at the line of her jaw, and at the faded gray of her eyebrow, and at the small cluster of broken capillaries at her temple, and at the thin, translucent skin of her eyelid, and he saw, with a clarity he had not given himself permission for in 19 months, the exact face of a person whose whole life had been quietly spent loving a man the world had called a fool, and who had, at 78 years old on a cold Montana morning on a porch she was about to lose, just been handed back her husband. He saw, in her, what he could not bring himself to name inside himself. He saw the invisible person finally seen. His own right hand came up, slowly. He laid it, very lightly, on top of her hand where it rested on Smokey's head. He kept it there. Sheriff Obed Haynes arrived at 9:47. He was a lean, gray-bearded man of 63 in a sheepskin coat that had been his father's and a battered brown Stetson that had been his own for 31 years. He parked his cruiser beside Kent's. He walked up the drive slowly, taking the full measure of the scene in the unhurried sweep of a man who had spent 4 decades learning to come into a situation without disturbing it. He nodded once at Kent. He did not nod at Prescott. He climbed the porch steps. He took his hat off. "Ms. Kowalski," he said. "Maggie." "Are you hurt, ma'am?" "No, Obed. I am not hurt." "All right. I'm going to make some phone calls. I'm going to have a couple of men come out here from the county. I'm going to sit you up in that kitchen chair and get you something hot to drink. And I'm going to ask you some questions when you are ready. That all right with you?" "That is all right." "Mr. Harlan." Haynes turned to Jax. "Marcus has briefed me. I will need a statement from you also. At your convenience." "Yes, sir. I would like, if you will permit me, to look at the excavation now." "Yes, sir." Haynes did not look at Prescott. He did not speak to Prescott. He walked down off the porch, across the gravel drive, and down into the gulch with Deputy Kent at his shoulder. The two of them stood at the edge of the hole for a long time. Haynes took off his hat and held it against his chest. Kent pointed at the coin. Haynes nodded slowly. He said something too low for the porch to hear. Kent nodded. The two men stood for another long minute, hatless in the cold, looking at the bones of a man who had died carrying a piece of Great Northern gold across an avalanche in the winter of 1920. Then Haynes put his hat back on. He walked back up the slope. He opened the driver's door of Prescott's black SUV. He did not speak. He simply stood holding the door open. Prescott, after a long hesitation, got out. Haynes did not touch him. Haynes did not cuff him. Haynes closed the SUV door and gestured Prescott toward the cruiser's back seat with one small tilt of his chin, and Prescott, walking like a man in a dream he had not yet understood was his own, went. "I am not under arrest," Prescott said quietly as he got in. "No, sir," Haynes said. "You are not. You are being asked to wait in a vehicle while federal agents are notified of a historical find on property you do not own, have interests adverse to, and were attempting to seize 2 days from now under an assessment that I suspect, before the week is out, is not going to survive an audit. You are free to refuse. If you refuse, I will place you under arrest for obstruction. You are welcome at any time to call your attorney. You will not, however, be making any calls to your office." Prescott got in the cruiser. Haynes closed the door. The federal inspector arrived the following afternoon. Her name was Dr. Evelyn Chow. She was 41 years old. She was a historical archaeologist with the National Park Service Regional Historic Preservation Office out of Denver, and she had been, when the call had come in from Montana, exactly 1 hour into what was supposed to have been her first vacation in 3 years. She had rebooked her flights, driven out of Denver at 4 in the morning, and arrived at the Kowalski section house at 2:15 in the afternoon in a rental SUV, with a canvas field bag, a soil sieve, a 35mm camera that had been her father's, and the tired, bright eyes of a woman who had been trying, for most of her adult professional life, to get to a site like this one before the site was looted or bulldozed or paved over. She introduced herself on the porch. She shook Maggie's hand. She shook Jax's hand. She knelt and greeted Smokey formally, letting the dog smell the back of her glove before she extended her fingers, which Jax marked with a small private approval as the kind of correct small respectful gesture you did not learn in a classroom. She went down into the gulch with Deputy Kent. She was down there for 3 hours. When she came back up, her cheeks were bright red from the cold, and her canvas bag was heavier than it had been, and her tired eyes had become something different. They had become the eyes of a scientist who had, at some point in the last 3 hours, sat down in the dirt of a Montana gulch and understood, with certainty, that she was looking at the Great Northern 1920 shipment. She sat at the kitchen table. She accepted a cup of coffee. She took her gloves off. She laid her hands flat on the oilcloth beside Henry Kowalski's journals. She looked at Maggie. "Mrs. Kowalski," she said, "I'm going to tell you a few things. I'm going to try not to use jargon. Please stop me if I do. Is that all right?" "Yes, Doctor." "The railway car door your dog uncovered is consistent in type, age, and paint layer with Great Northern Railway sealed express stock manufactured between 1912 and 1918. The painted number on the door, which I was able to clean a small section of, matches a surviving Great Northern logbook entry for a car that the railroad has listed in their own internal records as missing since February 14, 1920. The car was part of a 3-car consignment out of Great Falls bound east. The official position of the railroad, for the last 100 years, has been that the car derailed in a blizzard somewhere in the vicinity of what was then called the Whitetail Junction and was presumed lost in an avalanche. The load on that car, according to the railroad's own insurance claim of 1920, was approximately $82,000 in United States gold coin, in mixed denominations, being shipped to the Helena branch of the Federal Reserve. The kitchen was very quiet. At 1920 valuation, Chow went on, $82,000 adjusted for 100 years of inflation, plus the fact that the coins themselves are now numismatic objects of considerable collector value above face, plus current gold spot price. My preliminary rough estimate of the total current market value of the cargo, assuming it is substantially recoverable, is in the range of $28 to $34 million. Maggie did not move. The skeletal remains at the site are in all likelihood those of the railway express guard who was aboard the car at the time of loss. His name, per the 1920 manifest, was James Alton Whitefeather. He was 31 years old. He was a citizen of the Fort Peck Assiniboine and Sioux tribes. His family filed a missing persons report in March of 1920. The report was closed without resolution in 1924. Jax, across the table, closed his eyes briefly. "Dr. Chow," he said, "do you know who found him?" There was a silence. "Mrs. Kowalski," Chow said gently. "As to ownership, this is a preliminary view, and it will be refined by lawyers, but my preliminary view is this. The cargo belongs at law to the owner of the land on which it was found. That is you. The railway's claim was settled by their insurer in 1921. The Great Northern, as a corporate successor, will not have any claim. The United States may assert a federal historic interest in a portion of the material, particularly the guard's remains, and a representative sample of the coinage. for preservation and for the reburial of Mr. Whitefeather's remains, according to the wishes of his descendants, whom we will need to locate. I would guess that between 10 and 15% of the recovered value will go to federal preservation, and the balance will be yours. Maggie finally spoke. My husband, she said, in 1979, filed with the county a notarized notice of finder's interest in any historical artifact recovered from this parcel. Chow looked at her carefully. He what, ma'am? I can show it to you. Maggie stood. She went into the parlor. She came back with a thin manila folder that Jax had not previously seen. She laid it on the table. She opened it. He was a meticulous man. Chow read the notice for a long time. Mrs. Kowalski, she said, eventually, this is an extraordinarily unusual document, and it is going to make your attorneys very happy. I do not have attorneys, Dr. Chow. You will, ma'am. That night, after Dr. Chow had gone to her motel in Crestline with a promise to return in the morning, and after Deputy Kent had driven Sheriff Haynes back to town, and after the federal preservation team had arrived in a white panel van and set up cold tents and a small generator and a single soft bright work light over the excavation site, and after Prescott had been transferred under his own grudging compliance to the county holding cell for the night, pending a preliminary arraignment, Maggie and Jax sat at the kitchen table alone. Smokey lay between them on the linoleum. The percolator coffee pot had been emptied and refilled twice. Maggie laid her hand on the blue journal. I have given you the easy ones, she said. Now I'm going to give you the hard one. She pulled the third journal from the shelf. Brown leather. Cracked. The spine had been repaired with black thread. She laid it on the table. She opened it to a page near the middle that was marked with a thin yellow ribbon. April 3rd, 1996, she said. His handwriting was still good. It went downhill after this. Read. Jax read. He read of a visit from a young man, polite, well-spoken, a college student home for spring break, the son of Jim Prescott, 18 years old. Arlen. He had sat, Henry wrote, in the kitchen in that very chair and had asked Henry in great detail about every theory Henry had ever formed about the 1920 shipment and had, in the last 20 minutes of the visit, offered on behalf of his father a sum of $120,000 for the east 40 acres of the Kowalski parcel, including all subsurface mineral rights, including all rights to anything that might thereafter be discovered thereon. The offer had been refused. The young man had left politely. Henry had noted, at the bottom of that page, in his neat, careful railroad man's penmanship, the boy knows what his father knows. The boy knows where. The boy will wait. He is patient in a way his father was not. Jax turned the page. April 6th, 1996, 3 days after the young man's visit. Henry had written, in a hand that had begun, already, to slide slightly downward on the page, Jim Prescott came to the porch this evening. He did not come alone. He was with 2 men I did not know. He told me, in the plain language we have used with each other since 1981, that I was a stubborn old fool and that my wife would, one day, regret my stubbornness. He told me that he had waited 25 years and that his son would wait another 25 if needed. He told me that the land would come to his family eventually, one way or another. He told me that I should be grateful I would not live to see it. He left. Maggie was in town at the church social and did not see him. Jax turned the page. April 8th, 1996. The writing, on this page, had become shaky and was no longer level on the line. Henry had written, I am not well today. There is a heaviness in my left side. I will not tell Maggie. She has worried enough. I will drive to the clinic in the morning. The final entry. April 9th, 1996. The entry was one line. Something is wrong with me. There was no entry after that. Jax closed the journal slowly. He placed his right hand, flat, on the worn brown leather. Maggie, across the table, was not looking at him. She was looking at the empty chair at the head of the table, where her husband had sat for 37 years, working on a puzzle whose solution had killed him. "I always thought," she said quietly, "that he had a stroke from being too angry at the world, or from working too hard, or from his heart, from the family history on his mother's side. That is what the doctors said, and I never asked them anything further. That is what I have carried. For 24 years, I thought that I had not loved him well enough to keep him here. I thought perhaps if I had been more interested in his work, if I had taken his research more seriously, if I had argued with him less about the money he spent on maps and journals and trips to the State Archive, he would not have. Ma'am, he was killed. Not by a blow. Not with hands, but as sure as if it had been. Yes, I see that now. I see it plain." She did not cry. She did not break. She sat with her hands folded over each other on the tabletop, and her washed blue eyes rested, for a long, long moment, on the empty chair at the head of the table. Her chin came up. Her shoulders came back. Her mouth firmed into the same straight line that Jax had seen her mother's line photographed on the section house wall, and her grandmother's line before that. And Jax understood then that he was looking at the specific austere posture that prairie women had been handing down to each other, without any ceremony, for 5 generations. "He was not a fool," she said to the empty chair. "You were not a fool. I'm sorry it took me so long to know it." Jax did not speak. Smokey, on the floor, laid her head on the top of Jax's boot and closed her eyes. After a while, Maggie looked up. She looked at Jax. "Soldier," she said, "I'm going to say 2 things to you. I'm going to say them once. I'm not going to argue with you about them, and I am not going to negotiate. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am." "First thing, the woman from the federal office has told me that after preservation, after the guards' remains go home to Fort Peck where they belong, after the museum gets its share, there will be between $15 and $18 million remaining. That money is mine. By law, by my husband's notice of 1979, by the land that my father paid for and my husband paid for and I have paid for with my pension for 49 years. That money is mine." "Yes, ma'am. Half of it is yours." I said I would not argue. Her hand came down, lightly but firmly, flat on the oilcloth. "You heard me. Your dog heard me. The chair at the end of this table heard me. Half of it is yours." He looked at her. He looked at her for a long time, and his mouth worked, and no words came, and he understood with a certain quiet finality that the old woman across from him, who had not raised her voice even once in the 8 days he had known her, was not a woman who was going to be moved from a position she had taken on behalf of her dead husband. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I cannot take that. You came out here for more than that, soldier, and both of us know it. My Henry died invisible." Her voice did not shake. "You have been invisible for 19 months. I have been invisible for 20 years. My father came home from Normandy and was invisible for the rest of his life. This dog at your feet has been invisible to every person who has looked at her except you and me. This gold, Jax Harlan, does not make us visible. Other people's opinions do not make us visible. Making the right kind of noise on a television show does not make us visible. There is no visibility coming for us. That is a lie that the young tell themselves." She drew in a breath. "What this gold does, for the first time in a very long time, is give us choice, and choice is all the invisible have ever had. Choice is all that has ever been ours. You are going to take half, and you are going to make a choice with it. You do not have to make it tonight. You do not have to make it this year, but you are going to take it, and you're going to make a choice, and that is the end of it." He sat with that. He sat with it for a long, long time. At the end of it, He reached across the table, and he laid his hand on top of her hand, the same way he had, that morning, on the porch, when she had been on her knees with her fingers in Smokey's fur. "I would like," he said slowly, "to do one thing with that money, ma'am, if you will let me. I would like to build a place on this land, where men like me can come and stay. Not a hospital, not a program, just a place, cabins, work, animals, quiet, a place where a man can come down off the road for a year, or for 6 months, or for the rest of his life, and not have to explain why he cannot sleep at night. I would like to build that on your land if you will let me. And I would like you to live in this house, in that chair at the head of that table, for as long as you are able, and when you are not able, I would like to care for you, the way a son would." Maggie did not answer for a very long time. When she answered by turning her hand over under his, and closing her fingers around his fingers. "Yes," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Outside, in the cold, dark gulch, the soft, bright worklight of the Federal Preservation Team burned down on the painted boxcar door of the Great Northern Railway, 1920 lost shipment, and somewhere on a reservation 200 miles east, a young park ranger was, that very night, picking up the phone to call the grandson of a man named James Alton Whitefeather, who had been a railway express guard, and who was about, finally, after 106 years, to come home. The following morning, Deputy Marcus Kent drove up the rutted drive of the Kowalski section house with a manila folder on the passenger seat of his cruiser. He handed the folder to Jax on the porch. Inside the folder were 3 things. The first was a copy of the sheriff's office formal filing, under Sheriff Obed Haynes's signature, of a civil rights complaint against Arlen Prescott for misuse of office, fraud, and selective tax enforcement on the basis of targeted gain. The second was a cover letter from Sheriff Haynes requesting through channels that the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Montana look into the matter. The third was a photocopy of a document that Jax had not seen since 2019, his own DD-214. His Certificate of Honorable Discharge. Sheriff Haynes had attached it, Kent explained quietly, as a supporting document to establish the character of the veteran whom Prescott had attempted to intimidate. "Obed said to tell you, Mr. Harlan," Kent said, "that he wanted a copy of that in the federal file. He said a man deserves to have his service known in a room where it matters." Jax looked at the photocopy. He looked at his own name printed in the careful typeset of the United States military. He looked at the list of his decorations, which he had not, in 3 years, looked at. He looked, for a long moment, at the line at the bottom. Character of service, honorable. He folded the photocopy carefully. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. "Thank you, Deputy." "Yes, sir." Kent started to turn. "Yes, sir. When you drove up here on the 4th day, when you checked my registration, you already knew." Kent looked at him. "I had my suspicions, sir. Yes." "Why did you come out? If you knew." Kent's jaw moved. "Because I knew what Prescott was going to do to her, sir," he said quietly. "And I needed to make sure there was someone between her and him when he tried." He touched the brim of his hat. He walked back to his cruiser. He drove away. 6 weeks later, the first frost of real winter came down over Whitetail County in the small hours of a Tuesday morning, and at 5:51, in the pale blue pre-dawn light, Jax Harlan stood on the back porch of the Kowalski section house with his hands around a hot tin mug and his breath making slow clouds in the cold. Smokey sat at his right boot. Down the slope, where the gulch ran east toward the collapsed trestle, the bright yellow stakes and orange flagging of the survey crew marked the footprint of the first 3 cabins, which would go up in the spring. Along the old spur line, federal preservation teams had finished their work and gone home, and a modest wooden marker had been set into the earth near the gulch, hand-lettered, with the name James Alton Whitefeather on it and the words "Brought Home." The section house behind him was warm. The kitchen light was on. He could hear Maggie moving, slowly, at the stove. Down on the county road, a blue pickup slowed, idled for a beat at the mouth of the drive, and moved on. Dale Vickers, in his scrapyard Carhartt, did not look up toward the porch. Jax did not need him to. The screen door opened. Maggie stepped out with a second tin mug. She handed it to him. She laid her free hand on Smokey's head. "Your dog," she said, "has the finest manners of any creature I have ever known." "Yes, ma'am." She looked out, past the gulch, past the cottonwoods, at the first thin yellow line of sun coming up over the eastern fence posts. The light caught the rusted rails of the old Great Northern Spur and made them, for a long, quiet moment, look exactly like veins of soft new gold laid across the land. Henry Kowalski's blue cloth-bound journal lay open on the porch rail. "He would have liked you, Jax," Maggie said softly. Jax did not answer. He did not need to. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.